We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 16th of July 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. This is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, Israel has bombed the city of Suwayda in Syria following days of sectarian violence and a shaky ceasefire between Druze and government-backed forces. We'll get the detail. As the US and Australia clamp down on foreign students, they're being encouraged to apply elsewhere. We'll investigate how New Zealand, Japan, France and South Korea hope to grow their economies and skills base by enticing international scholars. We'll have a roundup of the front pages from our security correspondent in Zurich and look at new regulations that could be introduced in Hong Kong to make ride-hailing platforms legal. Then,
here is a way of bringing life back to a place, renovating it in the process, but keeping its character and doing so in a sustainable way.
Our foreign editor Alexis Self reveals the contents of our summer special publication, Mediterraneo. We'll get the latest architecture news, and finally, we'll find out who has been nominated for Emmy Awards. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. The US has deported migrants to Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, following a Supreme Court ruling easing third country removals. Britain ran a secret evacuation plan for Afghans after a major data breach exposed their identities to the Taliban. And a volcano has erupted in southwest Iceland, the latest in a series of recent outbreaks near Reykjavik. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Israel has bombed Syrian government forces near the city of Suwayda, saying they were preparing to attack the local Druze population. This follows days of brutal sectarian clashes between Druze militias and Bedouin tribes that have left at least 200 dead. Syrian forces entered Suwayda for the first time in the post-Assad era, triggering reports of looting, extrajudicial killings and a fragile ceasefire that appears to be fraying. The Israeli intervention and US pressure to halt it has raised the stakes in what's fast becoming one of the most volatile episodes in Syria's transition. Well, I'm joined now to discuss this from Istanbul by Ruth Michelson, who's a journalist and Middle East correspondent. Ruth, welcome back to the show. Can you give us more detail on this Israeli action?
Well, we know that overnight Israeli forces launched two airstrikes on Syrian government forces on the outskirts of Suwayda province, which is just south of Damascus, and another one targeting a military airport that was nearby. And you know, you explain the sequence of events that's been happening in Suwayda. It's a little bit difficult to understand exactly, you know, this isn't something that the Druze militias that are on the ground who have been fighting have called for, but there has been that accusation from Syrian government forces that the Israelis are acting in support of specific Druze militias in Suwayda, and that there have been these ongoing clashes with these Druze militias and Syrian government forces, and there's even been some encouragement from the Druze Sheikh Hizmet al-Hajri, who is a kind of spiritual leader in Suwayda. He was essentially urging the fighters there to confront forces loyal to Damascus, and now we understand that for the second time Israeli forces have bombed the area. So there are 2 accusations of a breach of this ceasefire that was agreed yesterday.
So who are the Druze? Why does Israel want to protect them?
Well, the Druze are a religious sect that spans right across the Levant. They're found across southern Syria, into parts of the occupied Golan Heights, and into what is now Israel, and also in Lebanon. They are a group that has... in Suwayda is an area that has really resisted control by Damascus even before the fall of the Assad regime. There were people there protesting in 2023, I believe, saying that the government wasn't protecting them and providing services, providing basic things, that there had been neglect of the area. And after the Assad regime fell, these same groups, these same militias, some of the same protesters said, we will keep protesting until we get what we've been asking for, which is recognition and respect from the central government, the provision of basic services. That tension has continued, and there has been fracturing between some of the groups where there have been accusations that that they have been visiting Israel, that they've been quite keen or courted Israeli support in this clash between them and the central government. And that has more recently broken out into open fighting, essentially, between Syrian government forces, which entered Suwayda for the first time since the fall of the Assad regime earlier this week. And now the Israeli government have said yesterday that they were conducting these strikes on Suwayda because they wanted to remove weaponry that they believed that forces loyal to Damascus might use against these Druze militias, which they say are being which they say are under threat.
I wonder what Israel gains by intervening at this point, and if it might expand its military footprint deeper into Syria now. I mean, we know that they've been there's been there have been conversations between the Syrian government and Israel. They're trying to re-establish diplomatic connections. Does this mean that détente is over and we're just going to see Israel getting more and more entrenched?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to remember this is not happening that far from an area where we've seen Israeli forces encroaching way past the demilitarized zone in the occupied Golan Heights. This isn't that far from Damascus, and that there are places that are now under Israeli military control, creeping further towards Dara, and now there are these strikes in Suwayda. So this is absolutely an expansion of what we've seen Israel doing in southern Syria. It absolutely threatens any idea of a sort of détente with the new government in Damascus. And I mean, there's an argument that this is something that is, it's increasing this fracturing. There is already this problem that Damascus doesn't necessarily have control over large parts of the country, and that this has been a problem that, the new government and al-Shara have been wrestling with since December, and we see it up in parts of the northeast with Kurdish forces. That question hasn't necessarily been resolved, and so there is a real pressure on the government in Damascus to keep control, but also to do so without cracking down on religious minorities, including the Druze, including the Alawites, for example, where we saw an outburst of sectarian violence earlier this year. And there is an idea that with these strikes, Israel is exploiting that tension. It's something that gives the government in Damascus a lot of fear that this will further undermine their control, increase that fracturing, and make it harder for them to have cohesive control moving forward to build up the country as we see their American interlocutors want them to do.
Well, we know that the UK has resumed processing Syrian asylum claims. After this latest action, can the country be deemed safe to return, or will Westminster have to halt that process once again?
Well, it seems like there's an inherent tension in trying to figure out how to process these asylum claims, because these are people who fled to the UK while Bashar al-Assad was still in power, and fearing the brutality that his regime represented, where they feared speaking out and terrible things could happen to people for resisting his rule. The question for the authorities in the UK is now what risk people might be under if they were returned to Syria. And this is something that there is pressure from refugee rights groups to process these claims on a case-by-case basis. So rather than making a broad distinction about whether this kind of violence that we're seeing right now in Suwayda means that somebody else might be under threat, they are encouraged. There are 7,000 asylum claims that are waiting to be processed in the UK, and there's now essentially pressure on the UK authorities to process these, but to examine them individually rather than making a kind of broad distinction about the overall safety of people in Syria.
What is Syria's biggest chance of prosperity and success? Does it rely on outside actors? How might we see this situation come right?
I mean, I think at the moment, we're seeing this new wave of support for what Syria is trying to do from the US, right? There were rather surprising development, posters showing Donald Trump's face all over Syria after he lifted financial sanctions on the country. And that was something that, was met with a lot of joy, because there were people saying, okay, we can be reintegrated back into the global financial system. This is going to give us a real shot at building up the country. And I mean, that's one part of it. But the other part is also about, the average person being able to have confidence in the system as it stands and feeling like they have a chance to live their lives free of oppression, free of the kind of crushing pressure that the state represented before. And that's something that the new government in Damascus is certainly responsive to international pressure when they see that coming from European countries, somewhat from the United States, and even from places like Turkey. But, it's really a question, I think, that has been on a lot of people's minds increasingly since some of the violence that we saw in March, which is how responsive is this new government to things that represent this kind of a challenge, protecting religious sects and minorities that weren't necessarily part of their struggle before, and really trying to figure out how to create this kind of pluralistic government that does look like something closer to a representative democracy, while also being able to completely restart a country in terms of economic opportunities and all the other things that we see that their American partners want. And it is a huge challenge, but as we're seeing this week, it's one that they've been struggling to meet.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. That's Ruth Michelson there, journalist and Middle East correspondent, joining from Istanbul. This is The Globalist. It is 18:13 in Wellington, 7:13 here in London. New Zealand has announced plans to double its international education market by 2034, aiming to bring in more than $7 billion New Zealand dollars a year. The country's relaxing visa rules, expanding post-study work rights and targeting students from Asia and Latin America, just as traditional education powerhouses like the US and Australia are moving to curb international enrolments. France and South Korea also also Japan are stepping up their recruitment in what's fast becoming a geopolitical contest for global talent. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Latika Burke, who's a writer-at-large for the Australian publication The Nightly, and Alex von Tunzelmann, a historian and broadcaster. So welcome to you both. Many thanks for coming on the show. Latika, what's driving this push by New Zealand?
New Zealand needs economic growth, essentially, and just like all of us, we're all looking around for the magic recipe there. And New Zealand has decided to double down on an industry that many others are starting to shut out, particularly Australia across the ditch, of course, will be key, but also Canada. That's been another country that's talked about cutting student numbers, and the UK. So New Zealand is really looking around here and hoping to seize the opportunity left open to it by others.
And Alex, if we could bring you in here, are New Zealand and other countries where this is happening, are they seeing this as a soft power move rather than an economic one?
Well, it is a bit of both, but I think economics is really the big driver here. I mean, effectively, this is an incredibly lucrative market of international students. You mentioned from China, but also from Latin America, Africa, Asia, all around the world, who pay pretty enormous fees to come and study at the prestigious universities in the developed world. And with certain countries, the UK, US, Australia and so on, shutting their doors, putting caps on migration, imposing levies, even in Trump's case, kind of threatening to throw out some international students. Naturally, these billions of dollars are going to look elsewhere.
Latika, I wonder how New Zealand's approach compares to what we're seeing in France, Japan and South Korea. Are they all approaching it the same way?
I think New Zealand has a unique opportunity here to really seize a lot of these dollars on offer. It's a very friendly country. It's close to Australia, so you would expect some sort of cross-tourism there. But also what's alongside this is they're relaxing some of the visa rules that allow students to work a bit longer. It's only 5 hours a week. But the signal they are sending there is we want you to be part of the economy as well. And that's really interesting. What I do think is absent and what will be a concern for New Zealand is how they manage the housing priorities here, because housing is really the issue that has driven the caps and the debate in Australia. It's certainly the case in Canada that's been a factor. And New Zealand does have a housing crisis. So it will be interesting to see this debate and how it fleshes out, how it solves a housing issue in New Zealand, because I'm not really sure that they can really absorb the capacity they're talking about without a serious housing strategy as well, which is something New Zealand has not been able to do so far.
Alex, I wonder if any of these countries encouraging more foreign students want to attract educated, skilled immigrants in the longer term. Are they hoping that the brightest students will stay on after university, particularly in countries like South Korea, where there is a demographic crisis looming?
Yes, I mean, it would be entirely in the interests of South Korea and Japan, particularly that you mentioned, to encourage longer-term migration, especially from university students, as you say, tend to be very highly skilled workers. They tend to find skilled jobs. Historically, I mean, again, this has been sort of part of the moral panic around immigration in countries like the UK, that there's a worry about students staying on too long. But in a sense, that's completely anti its economic interests. You want these people really to stay around and keep working. They really become very highly productive members of the community and usually very well integrated. So I think sheer logic will at some point for some countries override that sort of moral panic.
Latika, what impact can a surge in international students have on a country's long-term global influence, its trade links or even its diplomatic relationships?
I think it's incredibly important. I think we see, certainly in our line of work, Georgina, the amount of elites around the world who are educated at Oxford and Cambridge, and they hold a real affection for this country. I mean, the amount of briefings I go to with European and Asian leaders who speak with an American or quasi-British accent because they've been educated here is phenomenal. Now, that happens in the Asia-Pacific region with Australian accents too. You hear that a lot from regional leaders there. I think they will be starting to adopt a Kiwi one. And they always hold affection for the country that they study in as a young person, particularly if that country has gone out of its way to welcome them, which is something that Australia, I think, in more recent years has been struggling to do. I think the added dynamic here is that we are seeing I think, the start of the end of the diversification story that was triggered after the COVID pandemic. That shocked a lot of countries into thinking, gee, we need to really find urgently other markets. We need to rely less on China. I think what you're seeing from New Zealand here, and it's also starting to happen in Australia, is a turn back to China. It's a re-embrace that this market is our prosperity. And this time, it's almost unashamed that they're going to pursue this, even though they know that the pandemic exposed risk here.
Because, of course, the US has just become an unreliable partner. I mean, Alex, I wonder if these countries will attract US students wary of how the education system is being eroded back home.
Yes, I mean, there's been obviously a huge amount of publicity around that. And I mean, you couldn't really ignore the point that international students are being made to feel pretty unwelcome in the US, very directly, actually, by attacks on specific universities like Harvard, by the Trump administration, but also, you know, in terms of, we've seen obviously kind of spontaneous arrests by ICE of people who are on green cards and who are academics and so forth. This does have an effect. And I think you're also seeing a lot of US academics thinking about relocating overseas. There have been a few high-profile cases already. And I've already seen an advertisement online from a university in Finland saying, hey, you know, half of our professors are women. We welcome academics from the US to come and teach here. So I think a brain drain will happen.
And finally, Latika, you mentioned that New Zealand has changed the hours that students can work, but that obviously they're not looking at housing, which they should do. What other support systems are needed for a large increase in foreign students, and will they be put in place?
Yeah, so going from the Australian experience, this has been a big part of the issue. And what you have are extremely segregated communities within inside universities. And this has fed a lot of the backlash against welcoming so many full fee paying students. And that's also important to keep in mind. International students are required to pay a full fee to come over and study, and they're very expensive fees. Australian or domestic students will usually have access to a government lending scheme, so they're not paying full fees up front. So these are hugely lucrative markets, as we've said. They're, you know, in a very unrefined way seen as cash cows, and there's no getting around that. So language support is critical. How you house them is very important, and what programs you have to integrate them into the broader university society and then also the broader economy in the country is critical. I would not say that Australia has necessarily done a great job at that, and that will be a challenge for New Zealand to address. And it can, you know, it can show the model if it does it right.
Latika Berg and Alex van Tunzelman there. Thank you both very much. Now, still to come on the programme.
I do think for drama, we are going to see The White Lotus, and for the limited or anthology series, Adolescence. So I think comedy is the one that is kind of up in the air.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco talks us through the Emmy Award nominations, which have been announced by Hollywood's Television Academy. This is The Globalist.
Craft is a matter of perspective, a unique outlook, an obsessive attention to detail. With UBS House View, you get the big picture in bite-sized articles, delivered daily and curated by over 200 globally connected, locally active analysts, all focused on identifying the latest investment opportunities and market risks to help you achieve your financial goals. UBS, banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me from Sydney is Garana Gurdic, who is Monocle's security correspondent. Garana, hello to you, and many thanks for coming on the show. You're far away from your usual perch in our Zurich studio. What are you doing in Australia?
Well, yes, hello from Sydney, where it's a balmy afternoon, very sunny, and I am here for a couple of conferences, an event actually on Australia-Ukraine relations that's coming up tomorrow at Sydney University. So, having a dense card that's been rather busy over the past sort of fortnight.
Well, of course, everybody in Australia is talking about their Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who's on this charm offensive in China. Tell us more.
Absolutely. So you can't, go through newspapers or take a look at any of the news bulletins without extensive coverage of this 6-day, 3-city major tour that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, along with plenty of government officials as well as business representatives, have taken since Saturday. So they're currently jetting off from Beijing off to Chengdu, and there is a lot of coverage basically around what the kind of deliverables will be, mainly in terms of stabilizing Australia-China relations, but then also some of these maybe more human interest stories or soft diplomacy from various tennis tournament announcements all the way to some pandas that might be coming all the way down to Adelaide, to South Australia.
Oh, give us panda detail.
Well, this is part of the Chengdu visit, where basically there is already some representation or some contacts have been made to bring some pandas to Adelaide, to the zoo, and we were just told that we should expect some further announcements, which basically go with what China has been practicing now for over 50 years, this panda diplomacy, a way that Beijing has been building soft power around the world by loaning pandas to different countries and then taking them back when relations sour. So if we want to kind of speak the diplomatic language, this is a kind of I guess, whether relations are going well or not. So given that there is potentially some, new arrival kind of news coming up, this would tend to suggest that relations are going quite well. Unlike, just a couple of years ago, we saw some pandas being taken away from Washington Zoo when China and US were at particular lows in their relations.
I love that word, pandometer. It's all black and white. Fantastic.
I should trademark it because it just occurred to me. So I don't know if anyone has claimed it, but if not, then I'm claiming it. You heard it here first.
Now, what we also heard first was Trump announcing on his Truth Social platform that he's reached a deal with Indonesia. But Indonesia, like Vietnam before it, doesn't appear to confirm that. What's the story?
Yes, so we are now really in this sort of scramble of different free trade agreements needing to be announced, given that there is a looming date of expiration of some of the exemptions to these tariffs that came out, of course, from Washington already in April, and then some of the sort of postponements of that. And so on Truth Social, just overnight, President Trump declared that there has been a new U.S.-Indonesia trade agreement in which Jakarta would slash its exports tariff to 19%, while U.S. goods would enter tariff-free. So far, as you said, this hasn't been confirmed by Jakarta. Details are very scant, but President Trump has touted that the enhanced access to Indonesia's market is something that should be praised, and he is touting this as a win. And as you said already, it comes with the previously announced deal again with Vietnam, so sort of covering some of these key markets in Southeast Asia. But we are yet to see what comes out of it, and it does seem very asymmetric at the moment, given that, again, Indonesia would be still facing tariffs for its goods entering the United States.
Let's turn to Britain now, and the picture of these two now sentenced criminals on the front page of The Guardian is extraordinary. I mean, it's been that what they did was called a moronic act, and when you look at them, you can absolutely see that. They are men who carried out what they say is a moronic mission to fell one of the most loved and photographed trees in the UK, and they've been jailed. Tell us more.
Yes, Daniel Graham, who's 39, and Adam Carruthers, 32, received 4 years and 3 months each for the senseless chainsaw attack that felled the iconic Sycamore Gap tree beside Hadrian's Wall on that stormy night in September 2023. And this, I think, is more of a verdict on how the symbolism of certain landmarks, and especially some of the UNESCO-listed landmarks, as is Hadrian's Wall, what it means for the sort of public imaginary, I would say. And this is a place that's certainly beloved by picnickers, romantics, hikers. Has appeared many times on different feeds, whether Instagram or in people's photo galleries, and truly it just shows that for some of the erasure or the kind of the pain inflicted on some of these sort of symbols for people who hold them very near and dear, the punishment is quite significant. So the judge said that this act required planning and sheer bravado, and that because this can never be replaced or replanted in the same way, the punishment, sort of the sentence, is commensurate to the public and the wound that it left, not just in the landscape, but also in the public's heart.
Yeah. Well, at the White House, they are replanting. They're replanting Trump's hero garden. The Washington Times has a whole piece about who might be in it. The Washington Post, I beg your pardon, has an article about who might be in it. There are about 250 people, but some are quite controversial.
Indeed. So we've had a big story, as you say, a piece in Washington Post that basically looks at now the law that has been, or an act that has been fully signed into law. So funding has been appropriated and allocated, around $40 million for about 250 heroes, mostly deceased figures, everyone from George Washington and Rosa Parks, but also Christopher Columbus, and some more recent ones like Kobe Bryant, in a yet to be selected park. So there is money. We don't know exactly where it's going to appear. But what is controversial about this is that these discussions actually started back in 2020, and we know that that was the period of the whole monuments debates. High on the sort of protests of Black Lives Matter, when we collectively saw around the world, but especially in Anglosphere, the sort of examination of what particular historical figures meant for particular countries and how they should be appropriately honored and whether they should be honored. So again, some of these names maybe of people who are seen through the prism of colonialization or similar, are already drawing criticism for the ideological basis and kind of a push to immortalize some of the more controversial historical characters.
Garana, thank you very much. Enjoy Sydney. That's Garana Gurjit there, who's Monocle's security correspondent. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. A deportation flight from the United States has landed in Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, carrying migrants from several countries. It follows a US Supreme Court ruling that allows deportations to third countries without giving migrants the chance to argue they'd face harm. Britain secretly launched a scheme to evacuate thousands of Afghans after one of the worst data breaches in the country's history exposed their personal details. The leak put lives at risk. Many of those affected had worked with UK forces before the Taliban's return in 2021. And a volcano has erupted in southwest Iceland, the latest in a string of outbreaks near the capital since 2021. None have yet disrupted flights or threatened Reykjavik, though scientists say activity in the region remains high. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's 14:33 in Hong Kong, 8:33 in Zurich. The Hong Kong government has submitted regulatory proposals for ride-hailing services such as Uber to the Legislative Council. The framework requires licensing for all platforms, vehicles and drivers. Currently, providing paid transportation services without permits is illegal, but ride-hailing services have been operating in a somewhat grey area. The taxi industry has been calling for stricter regulation due to declining income. Well, I'm joined now by Roy Ying, who's a senior lecturer at the Department of Marketing at the Hang Seng University of Hong Kong. Many thanks for joining us. Well, what exactly is the new ride-hailing registration plan that the government unveiled yesterday?
Good morning, Georgina. It was just a policy framework. There's not a lot of confirmed details. All we know is that the platforms must be licensed. They have to comply with safety and service quality standards. All vehicles have to have license, commercial insurance. They have to do annual inspections. Vehicles cannot be more than 7 years. I think the only thing we know for new is that the drivers have to go through training and background checks. So that is the framework for now. The details will have to come in the later government documents to the Legislative Council. So I suppose we're going to have to wait, but it is a step in the right direction.
Why did the government leave the sector unregulated for more than a decade, given that Uber entered the market back in 2014?
Well, I guess I will have to repeat what the Chief Executive, John Lee, has said in a press conference. The problem is very complicated. On the one hand, the existing taxi industries do have concerns over safety and obviously their investments in the taxi licenses. But on the other hand, the hail riding services are actually contributing to giving passengers a real choice. And the problem is compounded by the fact that the taxi services have not been adequately meeting the demands of the Hong Kong passengers and tourists. I guess the waiting time of 11 years was also giving the government some examples and references from overseas countries, as Hong Kong is not alone. We wanted to find out how other countries are dealing with Ubers and other hail riding services, so we can develop our own framework that applies to our own context.
Yeah. So once these rules are in place, do you think a genuinely competitive environment between taxis, traditional taxis, and ride-hailing apps is likely to emerge? Can they operate side by side successfully?
I certainly hope so. However, we're not sure if these restriction is going to be improving the quality of the existing taxi services, because we know that these taxi drivers, the licensees, they are forever. There is no time limit for the existing taxi license, because these people, they paid as much as $7 million some years ago. Although now the license cost is now dropped down to below $2 million, but they are here forever. So these are the people that needs to be, shall I use the word, be more vigilant in terms of facing the competition. The government is also thinking about putting some restriction on the number of new hail riding licenses and drivers. This may be a concern because it's all about convenience, isn't it? If people have to wait a long time, or if drivers feel that it's too complicated or too costly to become Uber drivers, the demand, the supply will also drop. So I will have to wait to see more details to give a definitive conclusion. But right now, I think it's the right step it's a step in the right direction.
Roy Ying, thank you very much indeed. You're with Monocle Radio. Now, Now, Monocle's sunny special newspaper, Mediterraneo, is on newsstands, delivering the best of the Med and beyond to beach, balcony and boat. Monocle's Anita Riotta sat down with our foreign editor, Alexis Self, to dip into some of his favourite pieces in the edition. She started by asking him about a new form of hospitality in Sicily, aiming to combat depopulation in the island's rural communities.
In the 1970s and 80s in Friuli Venezia Giulia region in the north of Italy, a young hospitality consultant called Giancarlo Dall'Ara came up with this idea of the albergo diffuso, which is basically scattered hotel. So rather than having a hotel in one building in one of these abandoned villages or a village that has lots of different buildings or rooms that aren't being used, the hotel is kind of scattered around an abandoned village. I went to one in Ragusa in southeastern Sicily. Beautiful, beautiful town. The town itself has done very well recently. It was the setting for Inspector Montalbano, so it's become a big tourist destination. But I met Michele Bitetti, who has turned in the old town of Ragusa a collection of abandoned buildings into an albergo diffuso.
So since you visited one yourself, what was the reception it was having from both guests and the larger community?
So on a late May afternoon, it was a beautiful place to be. The place is called Giardini sul Duomo, and it's a reference to Ragusa's cathedral, and it's got a beautiful sort of terrace garden. I mean, I'm looking at the photo now, that looks out over the new town of Ragusa, where lots of people who left the old town moved to modern buildings, apartment buildings. But that kind of spreads out over the hilltop on the other side, and then you're surrounded by old Ragusa. It's beautiful. I think it's funny that he was talking about the reaction of locals to him opening the hotel, and at first they were a bit suspicious. You know, they were kind of skeptical of the benefits of transforming their former neighbours' buildings into hotel rooms. Actually, I think the people who lived in Ragusa are really happy, because these old crumbling abandoned buildings have been transformed, and it's brought life into the streets again. And, you know, people talk so much about sustainable tourism these days and how to prevent over-tourism. Here is a way of bringing life back to a place, renovating it in the process, but keeping its character, and doing so in a sustainable way.
So we're going to leave the island of Sicily, but stay in Italy. But before we get into your potentially contrarian take, can you paint a picture for us? What is an Italian bagno?
So a bagno, as you well know, is a beach club, which, you know, you have beach clubs all over the world, so that's not unusual. The thing in Italy is that most of the beaches are covered with beach clubs, with bagno. These are places where you pay an admission, or you're a member, so you pay an annual subscription, and you get your own deck chair, you have a coffee bar, you have showers, you have changing rooms, you have a lifeguard. And it sometimes means that in places like Forte dei Marmi and Rimini, for example, big resorty places, that the entire beach is covered with private clubs. There's a very narrow strip of public beach where you can go if you don't want to pay admission to the bagno. Now, in recent years, there's been a kind of mounting campaign to loose, or rather evict, the bagni from the beaches and make them available to all the public again. I was at one of these bagni, and I just thought, you know, I was lying on a deck chair. There was a lifeguard there. You know, there were kids playing, people playing cards on their deck chairs. You know, people bringing drinks to tables, and I thought, you know, much maligned, but actually, you know, a very genial atmosphere, and it wasn't expensive to go in. So in this piece, this hot, sizzling hot take, I argue in favour of the bagno. I'd be interested to hear your native Italian view of them.
Well, I grew up going to the beach with my entire extended family every summer in Palermo, and we were definitely more of the ragtag, packing 1 million children into one car, 1 million giant tote bags stuffed with panini and lunch and sunscreen. And so the idea, to me, it almost seems a bit more manicured than my experience of the beaches, which is hectic and you squeeze yourself in and, you're basically cramped against the next family with their 1 million beach umbrellas. And that's sort of part of the charm. But listen, if you offered me a good price for a deck chair and an iced drink brought to me now, I don't think I would refuse. We are now going to leave Italy and head to Spain. There's an amazing piece in this Mediterraneo edition newspaper about how Seville, which has been called the frying pan of Europe, is beating the heat. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I think this is especially pertinent given the heat wave that struck, especially the Iberian Peninsula in June. This was a writer, Connor Faulkner, who's based in Valencia. He went to Seville for me and wrote this piece about how Seville, which, as you say, is called the frying pan of Europe, since it often leads the continent in recorded temperatures, and these seem to be getting higher every year. It's perhaps not surprisingly has also become a kind of at the avant-garde of climate mitigation. One of the most interesting ones is this method of using kanats, which is actually kind of ancient Arab technology used often in the Middle East, these underground aqueducts that they were used in the past to kind of channel water from higher ground to more arid, often farmland. But in Seville, they are taking water from deep underground and pumping it through these kanats that are often going through buildings or close to energy infrastructure or data centers. And the cold water in the metal ducts then cools the ambient temperature, sometimes by between 8 and 9 degrees Celsius. So that's making a big difference.
That was Monocle's foreign editor Alexis Self, flipping through our special summer newspaper Mediterraneo, which you can find on newsstands now. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
There's a craft to every question, which is why at UBS, we query every aspect of the market, working with specialised experts and award-winning research teams, covering over 3,500 stocks in 50 countries, all delivered in a comprehensive library, answering what you want with what you need. UBS. Banking is our craft.
It's time now to talk architecture news with Tim Abrams, who's contributing editor to the Architectural Record and host of the Super Urbanism podcast. Tim, welcome. Can we start with this incredible fairy tale castle by the Mad King Ludwig, as he's sometimes referred to?
Yes, commonly known as Neuschwanstein Castle, the work of, he's known within Germany by the more poetic term, the Märchenkönig, which is the fairy tale king, but outside Germany by the sobriquet, which you've just used, which is Mad King Ludwig. The castle, though, is the most famous aspect of his work. It's the inspiration for the iconic Cinderella Castle located at the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World in Florida. So it's almost better known by its copy, also including the castles in the Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty features. But the castle has just been granted UNESCO World Heritage Site. That's the original one. And as have other works by Ludwig II, his other palaces, including the Linderhof Palace and Herrenchiemsee, which are these grand, extravagant and anachronistic architectural fancies in the state of Bavaria, quite close to the Austrian border.
Let's stay with UNESCO because they've just announced the Prix Versailles.
Indeed, the Prix-Versailles is a very interesting thing because in Neuschwanstein you have the signs of the UNESCO granting World Heritage status to key projects around the world. In the case of Neuschwanstein, this is a 19th century castle which is intended to look like a 16th or 15th century or even early medieval one, and drawing attention to it and bringing in extra tourists. In fact, the Bavarians were quite keen that alongside the granting of the status there should be limits placed on the number of tourists. But the Prix-Versailles is a very interesting and later and less famous perhaps than the World Heritage status, but it's an attempt to recognise the infrastructure that goes alongside the World Heritage status which the UNESCO, the Paris-based organisation, grants. So it's also a means of acknowledging that contemporary design can actually enable and promote and support the work of its World Heritage status. So the Prix-Versailles has actually become famous and increasingly famous for acknowledging the quality of international airports. It began in 2015, but since 2020, the airports has become the key aspect to it, and it's also just been granted a series of lifts and some really lovely projects on there. There's a few ones like the Kansai International Airport in Osaka, which is an upgrade for the World Expo, which is a bit of a cheat because it was done in 1994. But there's 2 or 3 absolutely beautiful airports, and I think it's really interesting that airports are something that they are prestige, they are large amount of money spent on them, but everyone uses them, everyone's an expert on them. And the 2 that really grab the attention are the Marseille Provence Airport, Terminal 1 there, which is done by Norman Foster, an upgrade of Fernand Pouillon's 1960s terminal and Richard Rogers' bit next to it, and it's all been integrated by Foster, proof of his absolute skill as an architect of airports. But perhaps the most stunning of all is the arrivals terminal at Roland Garros Airport on Réunion Island in France. Again, the French flavour of the UNESCO project coming through there. It's possibly the airport I'm sadly least ever likely to use, but it's a lovely single terminal building, this grand, large open space with louvers and wide open sunlit access to the beautiful natural world outside. So I would suggest checking out the Prix-Versailles and seeing which your favourite airport is.
And before we move off that topic, what's the worst? What's the worst airport?
There's the ones that have been ignored, the worst airports, I would say, you take your pick. I mean, everyone's an expert. I would say Berlin-Brandenburg gets my vote. I'd say the one on the list which has been acknowledged, which I don't think is really that good, is the Terminal 2 at Yantai International Airport, which is a bit bland. But you can have architectural grandeur as Berlin-Brandenburg does, and it can still fail to operate as an airport.
Finally, let's have a look at the tallest skyscraper in Paris.
Indeed. Well, you're not allowed to go above the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It is the datum beyond which you are not allowed to go. Even in La Défense, which is the business district to the west of Paris. The Link is a new claimant of the second tallest building, or the largest skyscraper in Paris, the largest occupied building. I'm not sure what the Académie Française, which is the body which protects the French language, has to say about the name, but the Link is a 50-storey, it's basically 2 buildings, hence the name. The 50-storey Arche wing, which has, and then shorter 35-storey Seine wing. They share a common 3-storey base between the forecourt, and it's connected by 30 stories of walkway, so it looks like 2 volumes linked by a third, and it sits on, it's going to become quite a strong feature of the view to the west. La Défense kind of bristles in the distance when you stand in the centre of Paris and look towards it, and it stands along the axe historique, which extends from the Louvre down the Champs-Élysées to the Arc de Triomphe and out towards La Défense, the business district. So it will become quite a common feature of the French skyline. But it's also very interesting because it's a clear attempt to draw the worker back to the office, which is something that we were told we would see after COVID, and we're now beginning to see it being built out. So there's 130,000 square metres of office space, which is a huge offering. But there'll be lots of restaurant spaces, co-working spaces on the exterior, relaxation areas. It's a real attempt to seduce the the office worker back into the office and create kind of efficiency. But yes, it's topped out. It's not yet finished, but it will become one of the features of the skyline of Paris.
And how do you think it will change the character of the area?
The character, though, I mean, La Défense is obviously a business area which has suffered under the post-COVID regime as different office workers and different offices have different regimes as to bringing the office back to it. I think what it will do is attempt to change the character by making the rigidity and the kind of glass and steel feel of the area into a more mixed one. I think that there are more residential projects happening in La Défense as well. So I think the area as this kind of gleaming, I mean, it's ostensibly the largest single area of business usage, office usage in the whole of Europe. I think that will continue to make the area into more of a different feel. It will become softer, I think.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. That's Tim Abrams there. And you're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. To Los Angeles, where the Emmy Award nominations were announced by Hollywood's Television Academy. The awards are scheduled for September, with the major players coming through as expected. Monocle Radio's Tom Webb sat down with Monocle senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco for the lowdown from this year.
Someone once said, the secret to life is knowing when to stop.
Go big or go home, right? Mm-hmm. In a goddamn body bag.
A snapshot of a trailer there, a bit of a giveaway, perhaps. Fernando, the nominations are in. Please paint a scene for us.
No huge surprises there, Ton. Of course, you've heard The White Lotus, which I am a big fan, the Mike White series. Some people said the third season was perhaps not as good as the second one. Clearly, the Emmys didn't agree. So The White Lotus from HBO Max was one of the top nominated series. 23 nominations. That's quite a lot. Not the most nominated, though. So it's a year that we kind of expected the series to be nominated, the success of White Lotus. We have the studio from Apple TV Plus. No massive surprises, but I think later in our conversation, I want to talk about a particular show that hasn't been the most nominated, but I have a gut feeling that it might win this year.
Oh, don't leave us in suspense. Come on.
You know what? I'm not going to leave you in suspense because you know what, Tom, I think TV is also groundbreaking. I think it plays an important part in our lives. You know, we can touch in subjects like politics. And I think adolescents on Netflix kind of played that role this year. For those who haven't seen it, and I think there's a minority who haven't seen it, it's the story of a 13-year-old who was arrested for murdering a schoolmate. But the way it was shot, it was so scary, it was so touching, it was very different from anything we've seen perhaps. It was nominated for 13. I do think it's going to win the Best Limited or Anthology Series. And perhaps Best Actor for Stephen Graham, and the young boy who played, you know, the child murderer. I think he was one of the youngest nominees as well. He's only 15. It's been groundbreaking TV, and I kind of hope it wins Adolescence. So here I am. I didn't wait until the end of the conversation.
Let's find out more about what else it's going to tell us this year, because something is becoming more and more important as the years go on are the streamers, the streamers behind each show. Who are the big winners in that sense this time round?
Listen, looking at the list, I think Apple TV Plus had a very, very good year. The most nominated series this year is Severance, the sci-fi psychological TV, which is beloved by many critics. So yeah, 27 nominations, but also, and perhaps a little surprise for me, I knew it was going to be nominated, but The Studio with 23 nominations, which is the satirical comedy about Hollywood by Seth Rogen. You know, it's fun, it's a great series, quite lighthearted limited at times. I was shocked to see 23 there, but Apple TV, once again, a very solid year for them. So I think this is kind of the star streamer this year at the Emmys.
And then finally, we've spoken about a couple of surprises. Maybe there aren't many surprises on paper at this stage, but what do you think could be the shock of the night?
Well, the shock of the night, I think comedy is quite an interesting one. I think who is going to win is the studio, which is a newcomer, and they need fresh blood, especially in the area of comedy. Could it be The Bear? Could it be Hacks, with the incredible series by Gene Smart, which I think you are also a big fan, Tom?
Huge fan of Hacks.
I'm a Hacks guy, but I wonder if the studio will get that one. So I think comedy is a very interesting one. I do think for drama, we are going to see The White Lotus, and for the limited or anthology series, Adolescence. So I think comedy is the one that is kind of up in the air and perhaps will be the most interesting one to see this year.
That was Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent, and Monocle Radio's deputy head, Tom Webb there. Thanks both very much for joining us here on The Globalist, and in fact bringing us up to the end for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Hassan Anderson, Tom Webb and Anita Riotta, our researcher Henry King, and our studio manager Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. We'll be hearing from our editor-in-chief Andrew Tuck on The Urbanist. We've also got a touch of food on the menu, and we'll also hear Monocle on Culture with Robert Bound. The briefing is live at midday in London, where we'll bring you up to date with all the big stories. I'm Georgina Godwin, and I'll return on The Globalist at the same time tomorrow. Thank you for listening.